Welcome, everyone. I see you all joining. I'm Lenny Cummins. I am chair of the condo co-op practice at Cozen O'Connor. Thank you for spending your Sunday morning with me. I hope you all have your coffee and you're ready for an interesting discussion all about the house rules. So, just a little bit about me. I'm an attorney who practices solely representing condo and co op boards and developers. So, I spend most of my life in governing documents. We'll talk a little bit about all the various governing documents, but I have drafted them from scratch and I have amended 1,000. I have given advice interpreting bylaws, interpreting house rules that may be ambiguous. I have even litigated interpretation and validity of house rules. So let's jump right in. I hope you all got Marianne's email um, with the slideshow that I'm going to go through. It's kind of set up as a worksheet so that you can take notes if you wish on the right-hand column. But if not, I'm going to be running through my slideshow starting now. So again, today is all about the house rules. So I think the most sort of baseline question that I get asked from new board members is, how do the house rules fit in the grand scheme of all of these documents for a condo or co-op? So let's start by talking about what's the difference between the house rules and the primary governing documents. The primary governing documents for a co-op are the proprietary lease, the bylaws, and the certificate of incorporation. And for a condo, it's the declaration and bylaws. So the proprietary lease is really the operative document in a co-op. The bylaws are there to govern, essentially elections and budgeting and the corporate structure of the co-op. And the certificate of incorporation is sort of a very truncated version of what grants power to the co-op and to the board. But the proprietary lease is really where you see what the tenants are responsible for and what the board is responsible for. And it like outlines really the living operations of the building and the residents. So that is the primary document we're going to be talking about when talking about a co-op. The house rules really don't have much in the way of overlap, I would say, with the bylaws or the certificate of incorporation in a co-op. So it's really the proprietary lease that we'll be discussing. In a condo, you've got the declaration and bylaws. There, the bylaws kind of serve as the operative document between the residents and for how the operation of the building is supposed to go. So it's a little bit confusing because in a co-op, I'm telling you it's really the proprietary lease, but in a condo, it's the bylaws. But that's how it is. So those are the most important when talking about governance of the actual residents and the building. Now that we have an understanding of those primary documents, like where do the house rules go and how do they fit in? The primary governing documents really act as the core agreement between the board and the residents of the building. The house rules, though, then go in to kind of fill in like the color, fill in the lines, fill in the specifics of the daily life in the building. We'll get into a ton of examples as we go through it today, but the house rules really are there to fill in the blanks for what the bylaws or the proprietary lease don't spell out. So let's talk about some examples of what typically go in the house rule. Quality of life. This is the big one. This is where, when you're interpreting an issue in the building, it's typically a quality of life issue in the house rules. That is the most common type of house rule. I can give some examples of quality of life. We'll go into, again, more specifics later in the morning, but smoking, noise, nuisance type stuff. The basics of let's keep our residents peacefully enjoying their premises. Safety, access to units. There's usually a bunch of discussion about who gets a key to the unit and how the keys are kept. Does your super have a key? That kind of thing. Also, sublet and rental policies are often included here. Alteration the specifics of an alteration are typically there too. Pet policies, and we'll get into some really good conversation about how pet policies can work. There's a really good case on this that I'm going to get into that I think you all think is interesting. Trust policies um, can a co-op. This is really more for a co-op because in a condo, transfers can pretty much happen freely. But in a co-op, oftentimes putting your shares into a trust is something that can expose a co-op to a bit more risk. And so co-ops require additional belt and suspenders agreements or requirements. And that would typically be in a trust policy. That can be in the house rules too. Financing policy, this is a popular one. Are you going to allow financing in the building? Are you going to have a certain loan to value ratio that you're going to require so that you can only finance 50% of the purchase price, 20% of the purchase price? What type of banks can lend? Does it have to be a large commercial bank or can it be a private money lender? Move in and move out procedures are also a common one we see in house rules. Scheduling the move in and move out. This can be hours. This could be requiring a deposit. This could be a particular elevator that you have to use. How to schedule it. Fines. So we'll talk a little bit more about fines, but fines is a biggie. We're going to have a whole slide and conversation on fines. It's a popular one. If you draft your documents properly, fines can be a really useful and strong tool to ensuring that the residents comply with the rules. And it's a nice one too, because it doesn't require you to have to go out and hire an attorney to enforce the rules. You can issue if you're properly drafted in your house rules, you can issue fines just by realizing there's a violation. You don't need to then hire an attorney to go after the resident. Late fees, that's a big one. And again, it's for the same reasons I just mentioned above with fines. Building amenities. So for all of your buildings that have a fancy pool or gym, or even your laundry room, setting forth rules is really important for use. This deals with just maintaining your building. A lot of times, if these amenities aren't used with care, they will go into disrepair. There's also a lot of safety concerns. And this doesn't just go for a pool, this goes for a laundry room. You'd be surprised at the issues that transpire in laundry rooms from a safety perspective and just disputes among residents. It's a very common place for there to be issues, and setting forth the ground rules of even how you use a washer and dryer and what the protocol and etiquette is, that belongs in the house rules. So again, we have more people coming. Welcome. Again, there's no limit to this level of specificity that you put in your rules. And something to mention is that every building has its own personality. It's almost like a living, breathing creature. So the level and specificity of the rules really has to be tailored to each individual building. When I was asked to do this presentation for you guys this morning, I was like, oh, I'll just pull up a set of house rules and we can run through it. And I go to look at all the house rules I've written with so many boards and so many different neighborhoods and types of buildings. Yes, there are some that are just the standard provisions, but you'd be surprised at how much they vary. I mean, you have buildings who want to set forth how many loads of laundry you can do in a day. And then there's buildings that don't even want to touch on it. So you really need to, as a board member, have an understanding and have your finger on the pulse of the community that you govern. And to the extent you think that your residents would benefit from highly specific rules, go for it. And the other thing is, these house rules are really living, breathing documents. And we'll talk about how to amend them. But if you're a new board member and new to the community and you learn things over time, or issues come up that you didn't realize, you can go ahead and add new house rules or delete house rules. A great example of this is COVID. I mean, I've never written so many house rules as I did when in in April of 2020, when all of a sudden, I mean, how many mask rules? Sharing elevators, how many people in an elevator? And then, of course, now they've all mostly been rescinded. So again, they can and should change. And we'll talk about the interplay again of the house rules and the main governing documents. But these house rules really should be the living, breathing, everyday document that changes over time with what's going on in the city and in your buildings. Any questions on this slide? All right. So let's talk about enacting, codifying, and amending the documents. All right. So we talked already a little bit about what the primary governing documents are and the house rules. So a lot of the buildings I represent are new. I mean, some are also the original co-ops that were enacted that back in the 70s, but new buildings. When a new building comes into existence, who drafts the governing documents? It is the sponsor developer. And I can tell you, because I draft these documents, that the sponsor says, we got to get these units sold. Let's go, Lenny. Draft them up. Let's get them done. We're going to be owning them for a while, so don't make them too difficult. So there's going to be this document that is created by some developer and some lawyer without knowing at all who the residents are going to be. So the original set of documents is really kind of boilerplate for the most part to what is beneficial for a developer who owns all the units and is selling them out. And then, so it's really going to not have anything to do with what we just discussed, which is that sort of pulse of the building. So the primary governing documents, again, for a co-op, they don't get recorded anywhere. Okay, those well, the certificate of incorporation does, but the bylaws and the proprietary lease are just documents that are created. They're included in the offering plan for the original building, but they are not recorded anywhere. You would just simply, as a buyer, be given a copy for your own due diligence. But in all respects, like you're really not going to spend much attention on them in the beginning. For a condo, the declaration and bylaws are recorded on the city registrar site. So there's an actual website that you could go to called ACRIS, and you can look up these recorded documents. So again, like the house rules are different. They are really that document that is for the residents, tailored to them. So to enact a house rule, yes, the developer in the beginning is going to have their set of house rules and it's going to be boilerplate. But when the board gets established and starts to really understand who the residents are, they can be amended very easily, actually, which is an important thing to note. So to amend a primary governing document is a big deal. Okay. To amend a proprietary lease, I'm going to speak in generalities because every proprietary lease is a little bit different. But to amend a proprietary lease or bylaws in a co-op, you typically need at least 66 and 2/3, but all too often 80% of all of the shareholders to vote at a formal meeting to approve the change. So I don't know about your buildings, and I'd love to know, but so many of the buildings I represent, I go to an annual meeting and they don't even get quorum. 50% is typically quorum. So to actually amend a governing document can be really difficult. So you're kind of, without real hard work on the part of a board, really getting the community together to behind an amendment to a proprietary lease, um, your really only place to amend quite easily is the house rule. So, and the same thing goes in a condo. By law, the Condo Act, New York Real Property Law 339, sets forth that a board cannot amend the declaration or bylaws without at least 66 and 2/3 of all unit owners approving it at a duly constituted annual meeting. And again, oftentimes it's 80%. And oftentimes there's developers or unsold share blocks in these buildings that get veto power over it too. So, like, you can't make a change that would impact a holder of unsold shares or a developer or even a commercial retail owner. So, sometimes you're really locked in. That's the beauty of the house rules. You're not. House rules, the board has authority to amend. You don't need to go to the owners. So, it's like your little rule book that the board gets to have control over, which is really a beautiful thing because this is really allows the board to really listen to the owners and codify rules that are the right fit. So, how do you go ahead and amend the house rules? So, I'm going to speak in typical terms, general terms of what I usually see. Obviously, with everything I'm saying today, there are outliers, right? You got to read your documents, but I'm going to speak about like 90+% of the buildings that I represent, and I represent over 150 boards. So 90% plus of those, the board gets to enact the house rules at a duly constituted board meeting. So you send your notice of meeting for a regular board meeting, 3 days, 5 days notice. You have your meeting. You can vote on the rule. And that rule, then you send out to all of the owners. And typically 30 days thereafter, it becomes a rule. So that's it. Now, oftentimes the documents say that if half of the residents of the building lash out and say, no way, Jose, then the rule can be challenged. But I've actually never seen that happen. I've seen it, I've seen it, residents have tried, but I've never seen them get the requisite threshold. It's usually 50%. But so this means that all you have to do is the board wants to enact a rule, you call a meeting, you vote it in, you send out a letter to the owners, here's a new house rule, you're done. It's a rule. Pretty easy. So just make sure you follow the formalities of calling a board meeting. Okay. The bylaws will tell you 3 days notice to all board members. Oftentimes now it's allowed to be done by Zoom or by conference call. Great. You don't even have to all meet in person. You just need to have quorum at the meeting, vote in favor, and then distribute it. Then set your clock for, it's usually 30 days, and it's a rule. Just note that once you do that, make sure if you have a managing agent that the managing agent updates the full list of house rules so that when future tenants and owners come into the building, they get the new set. That's a little bit of a pitfall that I've seen where there's human error and you do have an issue if a new owner or tenant didn't get the right set of rules and then you're trying to enforce it against them. So they should be clearly updated in the set that gets sent out and given to new owners, typically by the managing agent. Any questions on that? No, you guys are quiet this morning. Okay, so we already talked about a little bit about this, but let's go into it a little more. Why amend the house rules? Okay, they're easy. It's easy to do. You don't have to try to get every owner on board or a big chunk of the owners on board. The board's power to regulate must be based on governing documents. All right. So that's a biggie. So you can't go into a house rule and overstep. So I just told you you can go into all these specifics. You have all of this power to make a rule, but you can't overstep the board's power. The board's power is explicit in the bylaws. It will say there's going to be a specific grant of power. The board may promulgate house rules. Excuse me. In the best interest of the building to maintain, the building and the community in orderly fashion. There's so many different types of grants, but that grant does the power is granted by the bylaws, and that's in both a co-op and a con. Can it be inferred? What if it doesn't explicitly say it? There's usually catch-all language. In a condo, I mean, it's usually a board has all these powers, and it's usually Article 2 of the bylaws, and there's a list of A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to like double O of all the powers that the board has. Then there's usually a paragraph at the end that says, and the board can do all such things as it deems necessary in the best interest of the owners. That catch-all is good enough for me. You got to read the language. Again, I'm giving you sort of general advice here. But it's typically explicit that you have the right to amend the house rules. Oh, and one thing I should mention, if you don't see the term house rules, that's okay. Oftentimes they're called just rules or rules and regulations or regulations. So if you see any of those terms, that is the same thing, okay? Are there any limitations in the governing documents? Well, we'll get into what that exactly looks like. But yes, there are limitations in the governing documents. This is a biggie. If a board oversteps beyond the bounds of the limitations or the authority, the house rule will not be enforceable. Okay. The house rule will not be enforceable. I do want to discuss the impact of the business judgment rule and reasonableness standard, but I think I'm going to do it after I talk about the next slide, because the next slide really just tailors into exactly what I'm talking about the limitation. All right, so I want to just go into a little bit of a case study, and then I'll come back to the business judgment rule. All right, we're going to talk about a case now. And this is going to give you a good understanding of what not to do. Okay. This is a case that was litigated for years. Both sides, the owner, this is a condo, the owner and the board must have been thousands and thousands of dollars on lawyers fighting about something that didn't need to happen by virtue of an overstep. Okay. So this is a building called Village View Condominium, and a woman, her last name is Foreman. She was a dog lover. She had a dog named Rugby, who she loved dearly, who passed away. And she wanted to bring in a new dog named Charlie. All right. This was a building that at the time was the bylaws were created by the sponsor, just like we talked about, a little bit of boilerplate. The bylaws, I'm gonna tell you exactly what the bylaws say, because I want to hear from you what you think. The bylaws specifically stated, I want to find the language for you. Oh, here it is. The bylaws stated, no unit owner may create or allow a nuisance in their unit from any pet. Okay. No nuisance related to pets. That's what the bylaws say. That is the only mention of a pet in the bylaws. Pets may not create a nuisance. The board here created a house rule, okay, that said absolutely no pets are permitted in the building for any reason. All right, let's not get into the fact that like this is a few years old. This is before pets were allowed for emotional support and physical support. But that was the house rule. So what do you guys think? Do you think that that house rule is enforceable, given that the bylaw said absolutely no nuisance from a pet, and the house rule said no pets allowed? Anyone want to volunteer?
Overstepping.
Overstepping. Yes, very good, Tatiana. But it took years and thousands of dollars of lawyers' fees for everybody to realize that. This case went up on appeal twice. The court ultimately found that because the bylaws contemplated that pets were to be allowed in the building, that this house rule was an attempt to amend the bylaws. So what do you guys think the court would have said? Actually, let me go a little bit further. The court also said the bylaws here stated, in order to alter, amend, or add to the bylaws, 80% of the unit owners at a duly noticed meeting was required. The condominium's bylaws did not contain any prohibition against pet ownership. In fact, the bylaws had a general no nuisance provision that included the pets. So, what do you think? So the court ultimately basically said that this is a bylaw amendment being masqueraded in the house rules. So what do you think would have happened if the provision in the bylaws didn't use the word pet? If it was just like no nuisances are allowed generally, do you think that that there would have been a different outcome and the board would have been upheld in having its no pet policy? Anyone? Well, I'll tell you what I think. Yes, the board could have done it. The idea is, there's a line you have to skate as a board when you're looking at, hey, can I do this? And it is, I always tell my boards, you can't step on the toes of the bylaws. All right. If the bylaws contemplate a pet being allowed in the building, you can't then come out and ban it without getting everybody's consent, 80%, 66 and 2/3%. You can't do that. So if a concept is mentioned in the bylaws, you've really got to like study it hard. Can we amend? Alterations is a great one. Typically there's an alteration provision in the bylaws. It's mentioned there, right? If you're going to alter your unit. Oh, I see something in the chat. Okay. Okay, Jennifer, I see you're asking, okay, who appealed? The board? Okay, so thank you for asking that. I didn't want to get into too much of the procedure, but it's interesting. The underlying court, the Supreme Court, which is our lowest level court here in New York, held that the board was proper. And she appealed. The owner, Foreman, appealed. So the board actually won at the won on their pet policy to begin with. Here's another question. Our board has board policies, many of which are actually in your list of house rules. Example, sublet policy, financing late fees. Should we eliminate these policies and include them as house rules? These policies are distributed only when needed. Seller versus house rules. That's a great question. So co- the policies you're setting, I always recommend that they get included in the house rules. Um, and yes, distributed upon need, but I like to have them all in the house rules. I think that creates the ability to enforce them, the ability to fine if there's a breach. Um, and really a policy is, no different than a house rule, right? Because policies are enacted in the same way. So oftentimes, I mean, I'm working on a set right now for a co-op, and they have, I mean, this is a building that's historical. They have policies for everything, and it's a very interesting building. So they have terrace policies, they have roof policies, they have a pool policy, they have um, racquetball policy. I mean, they have a policy for absolutely everything. And so the house rules start with a laundry list of the general policies, and then trust policy, finance policy. They're all annexed into the house rules. So yes, I do recommend that. Okay, so back to foreman. Um, and I'll try to keep my eye on the chat a little better. Sorry, guys. Oh, here's another one. Is this related? Okay, we'll get to this one. It's not exactly related. I'll get to that one at the end of foreman. So I was saying an alteration policy is a really good example of what is usually included in the proprietary lease, but can also be included in the house rules. So if the proprietary lease or bylaws say no unit owner or shareholder may structurally alter the interior of the unit without prior written consent of the board. Okay. You can then go into the house rules and say alterations in the unit can only take place 9 to 5. Alterations need to be subject to an alteration agreement, which I highly recommend. Because those are really just filling in the details of what the bylaws or the proprietary lease already contemplated. And it makes sense to keep those specifics and details in the house rules because those are much easier to change and they'll need to be changed as time goes on. So there we have the situation where it is mentioned in the main primary governing document, but it makes sense, and in fact, recommended to put it up to fill in the details in the house rules. So, well, what if a board went into the house rules and said, no unit owner alterations will be permitted? Okay, that obviously wouldn't be allowed because obviously you're allowed to have alterations. That is a direct overstep and contradiction. But as long as you're just filling in the specifics of what is already authorized, it's permissible. All right. Now I'll go back. Now that we finished foreman, let me go back to another question I received. I live in a small co-op, 9 units. Our current house rules have very restrictive conditions on who and how long someone can stay in an apartment. I think this is the language. Each unit will be permitted 3 instances per year of stay by unaccompanied guests, each stay not to exceed a week. Exceptions to this rule would need to be approved by the board. Is this overstepping also? My personal opinion is it is. Well, I don't know if you want to come off mute to discuss it, but my question to you would be, what is included in the governing documents, the primary governing documents? Is there discussion about guests? If there isn't, it's probably okay to have this as a house rule. So it really will depend. If you have a governing document and it says anything about guests being permitted or not permitted or any guidelines about guests, and then this is becoming more restrictive here in the house rule, I would say it's impermissible. But I don't often see guest rules in the primary governing documents. So that might be all right. Can a board replace the house rules document and write a completely new document? Absolutely. These house rules can be changed at the board's pleasure. You could delete the entire set and rewrite. Your shareholders and owners, you'll have to really like make sure you're listening to them and you understand them, because some may be like, what the heck? Um, you might need to do a side by side red line or black line, which shows what's being deleted and what's being added, but you can throw them out and put in a whole new set if you want. I mean, sometimes I have an old set right here that I might show you if we have time. Some of them don't make any sense. Some of the language in these is like, I mean, there's governesses being contemplated and things of that are really just like ancient fixtures of old New York. So yeah, sometimes maybe starting over is the best plan. All right. All right, we're done with Foreman. I hope you guys like that case. Moral of the story is make sure you don't overstep. Okay, I have another message here. Oh, am I not in full slide? I just realized I'm not in full slide somehow. I don't know how to make it full. Hold on. Why? My screen. Oh, maybe I have the wrong screen on here. Slide share. All right, let me try. Let me try. Sorry, guys. I want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen with you all. You're not seeing me in full view. Is this it? No, maybe. Let's see. Is that better? No,
No, we still can't see anything, Lenny.
can't see anything. All right, let me see. Let me try it this way. I mean, could you see them at all? You could see them. You just
Yes, we did see it, but in a different
all right,
setting.
let me play from the beginning. Let's see. Well, I don't know why it's playing only on this screen.
Yeah, it was just not the same that when you started it.
What did I do? Well, clearly I'm not the most techie guy. Sorry about that. Maybe I need to screen share a different screen. Let's try that as an option. I'm going to screen share all of you for 1 second and then see what happens if I do from the beginning. How's that?
Okay, now we're good.
I
Yes,
did it? All right.
now we're good. Yes.
Oh, wow. All right. I'm learning. Thanks.
Okay, there
All
you go.
learning
Yep,
today. All right. I'm going back to where we were.
there you go.
All right.
We're
All right,
good.
good. This is actually perfect. I wanted to discuss the impact of the business judgment rule and the reasonableness standard. And okay, this is a biggie, guys. All right. The business judgment rule is this beautiful shield that the law provides to protect boards. It says if a board follows its own rules and the board members aren't doing anything, self-dealing, illegal, which I won't even discuss because so rare. And of course, you all aren't doing that. Then any challenge to the board will be dismissed out of hand, be dismissed from court right away. No discovery, no depositions, no nasty long litigation, immediately dismissed. So a board can make a horrible, horrible decision. The stupidest board decision that ever happened, losing all the money of the board, having the building go into disrepair. Well, they can't do that, but basically make horrible decisions so long as the board is following its own rules. All right. That is that essentially is the business judgment rule. It is a shield. It is a beautiful shield. And as someone who represents boards, one of the main duties that I have, and one of the main duties I take to when I'm giving advice to a board is make sure when you're implementing a rule that you don't do anything that you don't put a rule in that you can't follow yourself as a board. Okay? Because if you implement a rule and don't follow it, you're going to be stuck in a long litigation. So if your governing documents say the board shall enforce the house rules. Okay, if it says that, they don't all say that, by the way, but it's common. And then you enact a house rule that says no parties will be allowed after 10 p.m. and you allow parties after 10 p.m. and an owner sues because they can't enjoy their house because they can't sleep and they're disturbed for these parties, guess what's going to happen? You're going to you're going to lose your business judgment rule protection because you didn't enforce your own rules. So really be mindful when you're choosing these rules, not to just sit down and make a menu of every rule you'd ever want to make. Because if your governing documents compel the board to enforce them, I mean, you'll end up being a police of your building. And if you don't, then you're going to be ending up in a situation where there's liability. Absent business judgment rule protection, what happens? Let's say you do that. Let's go back to this party example. Let's say you say no parties allowed after 10 p.m. and you allow the parties to happen. You won't get the business judgment rule protection. And what is the court going to then do? After years of litigation, the court is going to look to see if the board acted reasonably. Okay? Was it reasonable for the board not to enforce this house rule? So 2 years and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on lawyers. The board is going to be, this judge is going to look at each one of the board members and say, why did you choose that? You're going to be deposed. You're going to be potentially on the witness stand being asked very uncomfortable questions about, well, maybe you were friends with the owner of 10E. Were you at that party? I mean, is there a reason why you wouldn't enforce this rule against this person? I mean, all sorts of nastiness that the judge and these lawyers are going to get into. All right. So it's just a silly illustration with the 10 p.m. party rule, but you don't want to have to face that. So make sure when you're choosing a rule, I just told you about, you have this great authority and how easy it is to amend these rules. But if you go too wild, you may give yourself way too much homework. All right. And turn yourself into the police of the building. All right. I have a question from Carol H. We are planning an amendment to the proprietary lease to ban smoking. Oh, this is wonderful. I have a whole slide on this. So maybe I'll wait and hold your question. Are you saying that this can be changed in the house rules? Okay. You are teeing me up, but you're like 45 minutes early. So I'm going to, Carol, thank you. I'm going to have a whole slide on this, on smoking. All right. Okay.
Hey, could I just
Yeah.
clarify my understanding of the
Sure.
business judgment rule?
Yes.
So is this basically saying that we have to enforce all of the rules in the document, like sort of equally? And if there's a rule, and if we aren't enforcing the rules, then we're open to litigation.
So if your primary governing documents use the word shall, the board shall enforce the house rules, then absolutely yes. So make sure you look at your house rules and you're enforcing them equally. Equal treatment is a whole other thing, which we'll get into. But Andrew, great question. You have to look and see if you have the shall. I've litigated that issue before because not every building has the shall language.
Great, thank you.
And and I'll get into it, but if you don't have the shall and the board has sort of, if it says the board may promulgate house rules and that's all it says, you do not need to enforce the house rules. In other words, you'd still have the business judgment rule protection, but then it becomes an issue of, are you treating everyone equally? So then it's more of are you disregarding the rule for all owners or just some?
Yeah.
And that's a whole other issue.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you.
All right. All right, we already did that. Enforcement. Oh boy. Well, we were just discussing this. This is, Andrew, you really teed me up. Selective versus consistent enforcement, unequal treatment risk. You guys are really helping me get through these slides today. Thank you. Okay, unequal treatment risk. So, this is actually called discrimination. And it's not necessarily like the discrimination um, that you would think about at first blush. Um, New York corporations, of which co-ops are, has a provision. So the New York Business Corporation Law, BCL 501C, that says that a board must treat all shareholders of the same class equally. Courts have held that that provision applies also to condos. There's a ton of cases on unequal treatment. There's a famous one about requiring replacement of windows in units. There were some units that had an older set of windows and some that had a newer set of windows, and the board was requiring every unit with an older set of windows to upgrade their units at their windows at their cost. The court held there that that the board was essentially creating two different classes of owners, right? One class of owners that had old windows and one class of owners that had new windows. And if the board was going to require a unit owner to pay for a replacement of a window, that it had to be all owners that would pay for the replacement. Otherwise, that wasn't fair that some got new windows from the board and some had to pay for their own. This would be the same thing if you go back to our 10 p.m. party example and you only enforce it for units that might be on a certain level or floor, or let's say even that there's a unit that has really raucous parties and then another unit that has dinner parties that are much more manageable. If you only fine the unit with the raucous parties, that raucous party unit could sue you as a board for not enforcing it against the more manageable party, right? The owner with the more manageable party. That seems a little off, right? But your rule is specific. Your rule says no parties after 10 p.m. So selective enforcement would expose the board here. You would not have business judgment rule protection if that happens. And you probably wouldn't be able to enforce whatever fines you issued against the owner with the raucous parties. So, and the second bullet here is what we were just discussing, authorized versus required to enforce. Again, be really careful. If it says shall in your bylaws, make sure you really want to enforce everything that you're gonna put in the house rules. All right. More on the business judgment rule. I think we're ready to add another layer on the business judgment rule. So we've already discussed choose wisely in what you're putting into your rules because you might be compelled to enforce them, that you have to enforce them equally. But we also want to make sure you're getting business judgment rule protection. And let's talk about just the words business judgment rule. Okay. I mean, you have to have business judgment. Okay. So what if the board ignores something and doesn't actually make a decision? What if you all get complaints of noise? All right, a board gets tons of complaints of noise, and you're like, I'm not even going to discuss Unit 4C's complaints. She's complaining about everything always. Ignore it. Did the board make a business decision that should be protected? So you actually won't get business judgment rule protection if you don't make a decision. So if one board member gets a ton of complaints and doesn't bring it to the board, there is no business judgment rule protection. But let's say, what did I say? 4P, 4C. Let's say 4C, and she's so annoying. She's always complaining about something. You print out the emails and you bring it to the board meeting and you say, board, we have to consider 4C. She's complaining about noise again. And you all say, well, we think she's just really sensitive to noise. We're going to vote not to proceed and just to tell her, sorry, get earplugs. Okay, it's not a nice thing to do, but if you reflected in the minutes that you talked about 4C's complaints and you decided not to do anything, you get business judgment rule protection. If you ignore it and just press delete on the email, you don't. So what constitutes a board action? You just need to make a decision. And I always say reflect it in your minutes so that later, if there's a problem, you can say, no, we acted. We thought about it and we realized she's a frequent complainer and we decided, no, this isn't real. Or you could say, well, we called the doorman and no one else is complaining, just her. And everybody else is around the same unit that's allegedly making noise and no one else is hearing it. So we're not doing anything. You'll have protection. So the best thing I can tell you is, and this is something that's a frequent problem because particularly in buildings that are large, that have a large managing agent, large management company, sometimes they're not as able to triage the calls and the emails and the problems. But if they don't bring it to the board and the board can't make even a decision not to deal with it, you won't have protection. So you can't ignore. You can decide not to do anything, but that's a decision. Decide not to proceed. And there's a ton of cases on that because a lot of folks complain to management and to boards, and the squeaky wheel sometimes will get ignored and deleted after a while. But just bring it up at the next board meeting, put it on the agenda. 4C, again, is complaining. We vote not to do anything further. That's what you have to do. All right. Oh, I have a question. Okay. Hi, Lenny. Can you speak a little bit more about what the enforcement means? Warning, fine, etc. That might be my next slide too. You guys are really on this. Is this also defined in the house rules? All right, let me make sure that's my next slide. I think it is. Yes, it is my next slide. All right. And then you say, someone else says, we have no enforcement or fines in our rules currently, only a statement. Owners should endeavor to comply with the rule. Is this enforceable? Oh God, I do not like that language. Owners should endeavor to comply with the rule. What, you're gonna really try not to be a nuisance? I don't know, I don't like that. Could you give us an example of fine language for a house rule and how that's enforced? All right, great guys. This last comment is what we've already discussed. And I said, are you ready to die on that hill? Make sure when you're putting a rule in that you're ready to say, we're going to enforce it. Okay. Don't be too idealistic. Make sure you're willing to go and die on that hill for that rule. That's important for you. All right. So I think I'm addressing the questions in this next slide. Enforcement of the house rules. All right. So this is kind of an escalating list. You can skip steps. This is just all the things you can do and maybe should do when dealing with a breach of a house rule. The first thing is communication about the rules. Most people say, I didn't know that was a rule. All right. To some extent, listen, people aren't always reading everything that they're handed. We know that. But it's really great when you can later say, here's the package you were handed. Here's 2 emails. Here it is on our building link or whatever you might use in your building. So you want to really make sure that not only are you including the package of house rules when there's a sale or a rental or something like that, but that you're sending out the rules as they're amended. And if you feel like there's an issue that's coming up, recirculate them. You can recirculate the whole package or a particular rule. Sometimes when there's one person who's breaching the rules and a board doesn't want to get into a dispute, they'll send out the entire building, the paragraph. Just a reminder, no music playing after 10 p.m. No parties after 10 p.m., whatever the rule is. And that way, you don't actually have to single somebody out. You can just send a reminder of the rule. So communication about the rules. I think communication solves most things for boards, to be honest with you. Frequent communication is one of the greatest tools of a board. The sales package, yes, always included in the sales package. Newsletters. A lot of buildings I represent have quarterly newsletters. Some even have monthly ones. You could just annex the whole set of house rules or highlight one that might be an issue. Pets on leashes is a frequent one that needs to be repeated. Once you start getting into a situation where it's evident that somebody is really breaching the rules, and it's a frequent situation, the managing agent can call or email, or honestly, you could even have door staff, the super call or email. I mean, if depending on the personality of your building and how you all know this person, a board member can even reach out. Sometimes the personal touch can shortcut a whole lot of pain. Sometimes when things escalate and you get letters and fines, people dig their heels in. So sometimes the personal touch will work. The staff can go knock on the door. It's 10 p.m. Reminder to please turn off your music. Then you can start getting into the more formal approach. Managing agent notice. That should be a letter stating you've been breaching your bylaw, your house rule number 11. Copy the rule. We've received notice. This has been confirmed. Please essentially cease and desist, but the managing agent won't use that language. It'll say, please stop this act immediately, or we'll be forced to refer it to counsel. If that doesn't work, you can get your general counsel involved, your lawyer for the building involved to write a similar type letter. And then we'll get into the power to fine, which I hope will address the questions that just came in the chat. Power to fine is very interesting because it's different in every building. The power to fine really should be in your primary governing documents. There's a lot of case law on whether a board has the power to fine, and some judges have said that if it's not in the bylaws or the proprietary lease, the board doesn't have authority to fine. And putting it just in your house rules may not be enough. So it's one of those things where I'll tell a board that doesn't have it and wants to put it in their house rules, like, yeah, we can go ahead and do that. But I'll have to warn you that if this ever gets to litigation, there are judges out there who might say the grant of that authority and power is so strong that it really is something that belongs in the primary document, the primary governing documents. So the first thing I always do when I'm asked the question, can we fine for this, is look at the bylaws or the proprietary lease. And usually, in the bylaws of a condo, it'll be in that section, that Article 2 we talked about, that has that laundry list of all the powers that are granted. And it usually will say the power to enforce the house rules and to institute fines in accordance with same. That's like the typical language. So I love it in a bylaw. I love it in a proprietary lease. So if you don't have that in your governing documents, consider amending your governing documents. If you don't want to amend just for that, wait till you have to amend for something else and you feel like you're going to be able to get that 66 2/3 or 80% higher threshold, and just throw it in. Again, it's not the most popular one. Like, people don't love voting on, yeah, the board can fine us, but it really is something that should go in the governing documents if you want to be sure you're instituting an enforceable fine. Whether you do or don't have it in your governing documents, I do like to include fines in the house rules. I think having a fine schedule is a really nice tool in your house rules. You don't have to, but I think it's a really nice way of being transparent on one hand, but on the other hand, using it as a deterrent. Because the whole point in the fine isn't to make money, right? It's to stop the behavior. When you're choosing fines, it can get dicey. There's a ton of a ton of case law on fines, all right? And I'm going to get into that on the next slide. So I'll talk about what's a reasonable fine and how courts look at the fine and some examples of fines. But let's finish here. So another thing you can do is the reduction of non-essential services. Key here is non-essential. All right. You can't cut off somebody's elevator usage, right? But if you're in the type of building where people bring you the door staff brings you packages, you could cut that off. If you're in the type of building that has amenities, and let's say you have one of those key fobs to get into the gym, get into the pool, you can cut off the key fob access. You can require that the owner or shareholder come down to accept deliveries, and you're not going to send deliveries up anymore. You can take away anything that really is a non-essential service. And this actually happens to be a very popular and useful tool. People don't like to be bothered with a lot of these things. So you can do it. I usually say please to my boards, please ask me to make sure it's non-essential, because otherwise you could end up with a fair housing violation. Again, you can't tell someone they can't use the elevator. That's one that I've been asked. They have to walk the stairs. No, you can't make them walk up 13 flights of stairs with their stroller. No, not going to work. And then the most escalated, the highest level of escalation is legal and physical abatement of the problem, of the nuisance, of whatever the violation is. All primary governing documents do grant the board the ability to bring an action against an owner or shareholder. Okay, you can bring legal action. The law also affords, like the Condo Act, for example, specifically affords the board the ability to do that. There's both legal and physical abatement options that are typically outlined in the primary governing documents. Legal abatement would be a board going to a court and asking a court to issue an order. Make John Doe stop playing his music after 10 p.m. Issue an order. He's been doing it. We don't want money. We want you to order him to stop. And then if he doesn't, he'll be in contempt of court. And then, I mean, it can get as far as custody. Okay, if there's contempt of court. Physical abatement's an interesting one. Most bylaws, particularly in condos, but also in co-ops, allow for boards to send someone into the unit to abate the nuisance. I mean, are we talking physically use the key, have the staff open the door, go in and unplug the music of at a party? Okay, I don't recommend that. I mean, but that's what it says you can do, but I don't recommend that. You're going to get yourself into a whole mess of trouble. There's going to be a physical altercation. Next thing you know, your doorman gets punched in the nose. You don't want to do something like that. If there's a breach of the house rules that are something like, no umbrellas on the terraces, and someone has an open umbrella during a windstorm, yeah, I'd say go in, close that umbrella. Okay, you don't want to have a situation where an umbrella is flying off the 15th floor and breaking windows and killing people on the street. So you have to use a little bit of judgment on the physical abatement. I have an example where there was a leak coming from someone's unit and they wouldn't allow access in. We entered because there was an active gushing leak, and the shareholder sued the board saying you didn't have a right to access because you didn't give us 24 hours notice. There was a provision that said in cases of emergency, notice isn't required. And again, this was gushing water destroying apartments. And the board was granted summary judgment, which means that the business judgment rule protected the board. The board got out of the case right away, and the court held that we're not even going to look into what the board was doing because the board acted following its own rules for physical abatement that was allowed. But again, just be really careful. If it's not an emergency situation, my general rule of thumb is let's ask a court to say it's okay to go in and do it. Access is a big one. Bed bugs and infestation and hoarder situations. I like to get an order for that to go in, because typically when someone's been a hoarder, that nasty condition has probably, and bed bugs might have been around for a while already. You can go in and get a quick order from a judge in a week. Another week's not going to kill anybody, but gushing water, imminent danger, you have that right to go in. More on fines. So here I'm hopefully going to answer some of the other questions about fines. We already talked about that the authority has to be really in the governing documents. So now let's talk a little bit about the fines and the fine schedules if you decide to do a fine schedule. So it doesn't make sense what I'm about to tell you logically, because the whole point of a fine, when a board is instituting a fine, and I hate it when these are in emails to me, a board will say, we need to punish this owner for breaching the rules. You cannot use a fine as punishment. That is determined by the court. It can't be punitive. So then what's the point of a fine if you're not punishing somebody? Well, courts hold that the fines must be reasonably related to the offense. Reasonably related to the offense. Other courts say it's a first blush test. When you see the fine, are you so offended by the amount that it's obviously too much? But I really like to go with reasonably related to the offense. Okay, so pet defecation in the hallway, $2,000. What do you think? You think that makes sense?
No.
Some may not. It's offensive to some and not as offensive to others. Well, you know what I like to do? I like to ask the managing agent, how much does it cost to shampoo the carpet? $250 to have them come out and shampoo the carpet. All right. I know then that if I choose $250 as a fine, that I'm going to be protected. My board is going to be protected if they're challenged and they don't pay that fine, because it is reasonably related to the offense. You know, another one that I like? Okay, we all probably know by now, because it's been all over all the news, that short-term rentals are an issue in New York City. A short-term rental is really, I'm not going to get into all the details, but if it's less than 30 days, it might be a short-term rental that's illegal, okay? The Airbnb rule. So let's say you find you have an Airbnb-er in your building who's breaching the rules. And let's say you have a house rule that says no short-term rentals, period. I like to actually, I mean, as a first order of business, I like to do this anyway. You go on the website for Airbnb or one of all these host sites, you can find the address usually. I take a ton of screenshots of it, because as soon as they know they're busted, they're going to take it down. And then you have all your evidence already, but you can see how much the unit is going for per night. That's the amount I like is the fine. Take the profit away from the owner who broke the rules. Okay. So you can even say for short-term rentals, the fine will be an amount equal to the nightly rate per night. We can prove that there's a violation. If you can't find it on the site, but you know it's happening, you can use what a nightly hotel would be in the neighborhood as your fine. But the point is making it reasonably related. Now, there's some things that you just can't come up with, like someone who's breaking a smoking rule, someone's smoking in the common elements. There's no number on that. You can't quantify that. Again, that's a first blush. That's when you go into the first blush. Is $2,500 too much for smoking in the hallway? One time? Probably. There was a time when I would like look at all of the cases that were coming out to see kind of where the range was. And I used to think, and this goes back a long time before our inflationary environment, I was like, if it's more than $500, we have to really think about it. Obviously, we've had a lot of inflation. That goes back a long time when I did that. But generally speaking, $100, you're safe. $250, I feel like you're usually safe. Once you start getting into $500, I want to look really hard at how bad the offense was. And also when you're drafting, you should be very clear in the language that it's per offense. So you don't want to have to be stuck with someone smokes in the hallway and then all of a sudden you're stuck with $250 forever. It should be per offense. And offense, you know, you're not a court of law as a board. If someone complains and said, John Doe's smoking in the hallway again, you know, you can accept that as truth if you'd like to. It's better to have someone confirm it. So if you have staff at your building, it'd be great to have the staff keep a log. And if there's a complaint, they should go up to the 4th floor and smell and see if there's smoke. If someone's complaining about frequent parties after 10 p.m., ask someone to go up to the floor and just, do you hear a noise? Do you not? That way you know there's a little bit of verification on the number of offenses. I like to notify the person about an offense as soon as possible, because you don't want to have a situation where they're smoking in the hallway every day for 14 days in a row, and then you notify them that, by the way, you just racked up $250 times 14. I think it's better if you send a really quick notice after day 1, day 2, and say, we're fining you $500 for these 2 nights that you've been out there smoking in the hallway. If you continue to do it, you're going to be continuing to rack up fines. So, you know, the other thing is the collectability of the fine, right? It's one thing to just throw a fine on someone's ledger. It's another thing for being able to collect it. If you don't have language in your governing documents or in your house rules that say fines are collectible as additional common charges due and owing, or fines are deemed additional rent, that kind of language, the only way to collect those fines would be to sue someone for the collection of the fine. So, and this is such a common issue. This language is only there half the time. And it's still enforceable, but then you're going to have to pay a lawyer to go enforce it. Whereas if it's considered additional common charges due and owing. Oh, someone's entering. If it is considered additional common charges due and owing, then you have a situation where the breach is collectible just like common charges. Common charges can be collected. You can file a lien. You can even foreclose on it. So it's a much stronger tool, and it's a tool that gives you the ability to, terminate a lease. Otherwise, you're just suing for $250, which you're not going to do. That wouldn't make sense, obviously. So additional common charges due and owing, additional rent. All right. The power to abate, the risks of self-help. So we talked a little bit about this already. The example of going into somebody's unit, using that key that you have to go in and abate, and how to be careful. Again, it would say err on the side of being conservative. Go to court and get an emergency order to go in and abate. It just, even though you have the right to do it, doesn't mean you should. If there's some imminent risk to the rest of your owners, go ahead and go in. You're going to be protected by the business judgment rule, but you're going to open yourself up for potentially other claims. So really be careful when you're going to abate on your own. It's much better to commence a judicial proceeding. You can do so in an expedited fashion to get a court order that says, yes, it's okay, board, to go in and clean up the hoarding condition. That's typically, that's the primary example. Hoarding that creates unsanitary conditions. You get an order. Don't go in and clean it up yourself. Get an order, then send in a crew. The court will say, provide a certain amount of notice, and you'll do it. That's called injunctive relief, by the way, what I'm talking about. Asking the court to order is asking the court for something called an injunction. Now, let's talk about the chronic offender for a minute. It's one thing when you have a smoking instance and you can fine and then move on. What about somebody who won't stop? You get an injunction for this, you get an injunction for that. This person is just a problem, okay? In a co-op, you have the ability to terminate the lease. It's called a Pullman proceeding. Pullman was the name of the famous case. Some people call it voting the shareholder off the island. Okay, that you may hear that. written like that in some of the habitat articles and cooperator articles. But the idea being that you can terminate the lease and put the shareholders' ability to remain a tenant up for a vote of the shareholders. And if 66 and 2/3, for example, vote to terminate the lease and evict the shareholder for the offensive conduct, you can do that in a co-op. So if someone is a chronic hoarder, okay, you can't keep having to go in and abate and abate and abate and go to court to get an injunction, go to court to get an injunction. Eventually, you might be in a position to realize that this person isn't going to change and this person is a problem for our community. You can do a Pullman action, which is to vote them off the island. You send a notice of termination of lease, you put it up for a vote, and you get an order of eviction. The shares get sold, and then hopefully a new cooperator or a new tenant comes in that doesn't have the problem. This is very common with hoarding or someone who's just a frequent nuisance. You also have the right to sue for breach of contract. So if a violation of the rules ends up yielding a lot of damages, money damages for a building, repair costs, additional maintenance costs, you could sue for those damages and get a money judgment. Condos are much harder when it comes to governing the people. Easier for some things, much more challenging when governing people. You can get that injunctive relief, right? Court order to stop a conduct, court order to gain access to abate. Same way, same thing. You can do that. But there is no such thing as termination of a lease or a Pullman. I'll tell you about a little story I had on West 23rd Street. Really nice boutique condo. There's a first floor unit owner. He liked to feed the pigeons right out in front of the building. But he liked feeding the pigeons so much that he wanted to invite the pigeons into the lobby. So he started putting feed and propping the vestibule door open in the winter so that the pigeons would come in and he could feed the pigeons in the lobby. Okay, this is a very nice building, high-end building. People would come down and there'd be pigeons in the lobby. We went through that whole list. Remember that list I sent you? Personal outreach, management letter. I mean, check, 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 check. All right, this guy would not stop. To the point where, there's pigeon poo all over the lobby. There's feed. There's 20 pigeons in the lobby. I mean, these stories, I'm like, one day I'll write a book. I don't know, maybe people like pigeons. In any event, it was not hygienic. And he would not stop. We got an order that he had to stop. He disregarded the order, or he'd stop for a month and then start again. Okay. This guy also did some other things. He would go into the compactor trash room, open up people's personal trash and read through their bills and things like that. You never know what you're going to get. In a condo, there's no interview. And even, you don't always see everyone at an interview, but we had no idea. They had no idea and they had no control. Lenny, what can we do? I said, listen, there's no such thing as voting someone off the island here. We can just keep going to court to get injunctions. Now, in this particular case, we ended up settling, which is always the best thing to do. We got the court encouraged this owner's attorney to enter into a stipulation, which is a binding agreement that said that, if he agrees he won't feed the pigeons in the lobby anymore. And if he does, then he agrees he will vacate. So we got him a month later. He started doing it again. He couldn't control himself and he breached the stipulation. And so the court ordered that he vacate. But it took over a year of this going on. And honestly, the board spent a lot of money on my fees, which is, I guess good for me, but not good for the long term of the building, just to get this guy out. And it's I would say they were lucky getting him out after a year. So just keep in mind, in a condo, It's a lot harder. The lien foreclosure is a great way, a great tool. So we fined him every time he did this. $250 because we were trying to make sure we had clean hands. This guy does not care about $250. He was in a $4 million apartment, this pigeon feeder. So he didn't care about $250. That wasn't deterring him. But after a while, he wasn't paying the fines. We were able to file a lien. And once you file a lien, you can start a foreclosure. So at the same time all of this was happening, we started a foreclosure proceeding to eventually foreclose on the unit. Now, do I think it would have actually ended up where he would just have allowed the unit to be foreclosed on by the board for these fines? No, but we had the ability to do that. So that's kind of your only recourse in a condo. There is no ability to evict an owner in a condo, even for illegal behavior. I had a building where someone's mother passed away sadly, and the child was still in the unit and started using lots of drugs in the unit, lots of illegal behavior. Cops were called so many times, still couldn't evict. I mean, it's really, really challenging in a condo. So I just mentioned that all this money is being paid to lawyers to enforce these rules. That's so horrible. It's not fair. Well, most governing documents, and this will again be in the primary governing documents, and it has to be in the primary governing documents, allow for the collection of legal fees against the owner or shareholder who caused the legal fees to be incurred. 1 out of every 10 buildings I look at don't have this provision. So really go and look at this, because if you have a situation where you have a deep-pocketed pigeon feeding owner, you're going to be in trouble because you're going to end up having to spend a lot of money on lawyers. So make sure you check and see that in these sections in your bylaws governing abatement and starting legal action, that it says that the board can collect legal fees. If it just says costs and expenses in connection with the abatement, and it doesn't specifically say attorney's fees, many courts will hold that legal fees aren't collectible. Some courts will allow legal fees to be included and others won't. And that's not even a jurisdictional thing. Like I couldn't tell you, hey, your building's in Manhattan. You're in the first department. That's your jurisdiction. You're going to be able to collect legal fees. I can't even tell you that because it's really judge by judge. So you want to make sure it says that you can collect the legal fees. That's a really important thing for you to look at, because legal fees can end up being a lot more than a fine. It's a really important tool, and it changes the leverage between the board and an owner or a shareholder. Okay, I have another question here. You guys can interrupt me. I feel like I'm doing all the talking. Could you discuss best practices governing late fees and collection of arrears? Same logic that you're discussing about fines. Yeah, so arrearage is the same thing. I mean, we kind of talked about that a little in connection with the lien foreclosure. Oh, do I have another question here? Yeah. Yeah, again, just another question about the late fees. So late fees, again, they have to be spelled out. And typically I see them in the governing documents themselves, the primary governing documents. They're usually not in house rules. I don't know what would happen if it wasn't in the governing documents and it was included in the house rules. That could be a problem, because typically in the bylaws or the proprietary lease, it's pretty specific about what happens when somebody doesn't pay their maintenance or common charges on time. It'll usually say interest. It'll say, if it doesn't specifically say late fees, you may have a problem, because it usually does spell out they must pay within 5 days of the first of the month. And if they don't, interest will be charged at the highest legal rate in New York State or something like that. And if it doesn't include late fees, I could see a court saying, look at all the specifics that were in the governing documents. Clearly, if they wanted to include late fees, they would have here. If there's no mention at all about late fees or interest, you could probably do it in the house rule. But again, it's a judgment call. Each one of these is a judgment call. That's why it's not so simple. But the collectability of late fees as arrears, and whether it's lienable, is all about the language. Again, that language that says late fees and interest shall be collectible as additional common charges or additional rent. It has to say that to be included in a lien. another issue with that is sometimes the legal fees provision will say the legal fees are only collectible, or they won't say only. The legal fees are collectible in connection with a proceeding to collect the common charges. Well, a proceeding means court, right? It means court. It doesn't mean lawyer letters, negotiation, lien. So usually in those cases, you can't collect. So you really need to hang on the language. Like you need to go into your primary document and pull out the language on collection. Does it allow for late fees? Does it allow for interest? Does it allow for legal fees? And what legal fees? Is it all legal fees? Is it all costs? Or is it only in connection with a proceeding? You know, I tend to like my boards to have maximum amount of power on this. I don't usually represent unit owners. I represent boards. So I like it to be very general. The boards have the power to collect legal fees in connection with with a violation of the rules. That's my love. I love that language as additional common charges or as additional rent. I mean, that's the magic language. Then you have complete ability to fine. You have the ability to bring all these actions, and the board isn't going to be left with some big bill and breaking the budget this year because it's all going to be charged back to that offending owner. Okay. Overreach question from Greg. Within 1 month of the annual meeting and board election, the old board implemented a house rule. I love that. What is it? The lame duck board that they call it? I could ask this question. The old board implemented a house rule prohibiting eligibility of non-resident owners to run and serve on the board. Ooh, I think that's immediately sounds like an overstep to me, but I'll keep reading your question. The bylaws are silent on the issue. The bylaws, to the layman, this appears to be a material change that fails a reasonableness test and requires formal bylaw amendment. Your view on overreach in this example and recommendation of how best to handle the situation. 2 new board members were elected at the annual meeting in which the former board president did not stand for re-election. Okay. So, Greg, is there a section in the bylaws called qualification of directors or of, is this a condo or a co-op? Okay, it doesn't say if it's a condo or a co-op, but is there a section that this in the bylaws that says what the qualifications are? They must be 18 years or older, anything like that? I don't know. If there's a section on qualifications and it sets forth even that they have to be 18, I would say that you'd needed to amend the bylaws because the absence of that particular section about resident owner, I think is instructive, right? Because if it says other qualifications and leaves one out, that means it's not a qualification. And then putting it in the house rules would be an overstep, in my opinion. So if there's no section on qualifications, it just says, oh, does it even say, here's one, they must be in good standing, they can't be in arrears to run. I would say that's a qualification. So if it has any of these qualifications in the main primary governing documents, and then they added this, it's an overstep. And I think that Foreman case will allow you to overturn that rule. So, if governing documents are so hard to change, how would a board go about getting the chargeback of legal fees language into them? Yeah, that's the truth. So you can't, you have to change sometimes you have to just change the governing documents. So what I like to tell my boards is, all right, you have an annual meeting coming up. You don't want to amend the house rules. Start a document, a wish list. There's going to be a time when you have to amend the bylaws. You're going to be in a situation at some point in time where your bylaws are going to be amended. At least then you have a running list of things you want to change. Because if you go in for an amendment just to say we're charging fines, we're charging legal fees, it's a really hard sell for a board because the owners are like, why do they, unless the owners are really kind of intuitive and understand that there's a problem person or something like that. And there's a real reason to do it. Or if you really can just get a ton of proxies from people, it's going to be a really hard battle to amend. And you're stuck because I've never seen a situation where you can put the chargeback of legal fees into a house rule. It's likely really unenforceable. So, sorry to say that, but that's got to go into the primary documents. Carol, in a co-op, if the owner is not living in the unit and it was left in an unsanitary state and complaints from other shareholders regarding the smell have been received, can the board terminate this lease? The short answer is yes. The board can terminate the lease if it's a breach of the proprietary lease. But you have to go through the Pullman proceeding, okay? It's a whole step-by-step proceeding. You send notices, you do a vote, then you go to court. But you can. So, in fact, the hoarding and the unsanitary state situation is one of the most common for a Pullman proceeding. So you can. Can they go in and clean the apartment prior to termination? So this is one of the ones that this is so common, Carol. I'm hoping for your sake you're not dealing with this in your building because it can be a problem. I would go to court to get an order. I have right now, I mean, it's morbid and horrible, but I represent a co-op on the Upper East Side, and one of the shareholders passed away in there. And the police sealed the unit. We weren't allowed to enter. We had to get a court order to clean it, and that body was in there. I mean, you'd think you could just go in that situation. I mean, can you imagine what the smell would be like after 7 days of a dead body, and this was a hoarder who died in there? It's awful. But my advice, if you were my client, would be get an order. You can get an order quickly. I mean, 7 days is pretty quick, but it sounds like it's empty and hopefully not that dire of a situation. Okay. Let's see. How am I doing? Let's talk about some drafting. Okay. These are my 4 rules of drafting. Okay. You have to be explicit. Don't be polite in your rules. Sometimes I feel like boards, they're like, well, we don't really want it. That's a little touchy. Go ahead and say what you want to say. If you want, children to wear diapers in the pool, water diapers in the pool, just say it. Don't start talking about sanitary and that leaves it up to someone's judgment. If you have a problem with somebody and you want to make sure that, I don't know, that's a clear example because I just dealt with it. There's a pool and some of the children that aren't fully potty trained are going in without water diapers. And people are offended by that. Don't go in and just say following sanitary conditions, because a mother of a child might just say, like, my kid's not going to poo in the pool. It's a silly example, but this is what I'm talking about. Specifically say, be explicit. Children under the age of blank or who are not potty trained, who regularly wear diapers, must wear a watertight water diaper in the pool. Okay, it's a weird rule, but if you have this issue, say it. Don't try to be polite and don't try to sound like something you're not. If you're trying to address a situation, hit it head on. Be very clear in what you're saying. Obviously I'm a lawyer who drafts provisions for a living. I always say, if you have a lawyer, tell the lawyer what you're trying to say and have your lawyer draft it, or, have your lawyer look at it at least. You want to make sure that there's no room for different interpretation. You want to be very clear. Oftentimes these rules are ambiguous and there's multiple meanings. Well, did you really mean carpet needed to be an 80%? Well, does that include the bathrooms and the kitchen? Or is that only the living spaces? You want to just really be explicit and clear. Here's another one that really goes to somebody's question about endeavoring to follow the rules. I'm sorry, I forgot who asked that question. Endeavoring to follow the rules means nothing. Well, I really tried to put my child in a diaper in the pool, whatever. I don't even know what that means. She cried, so I didn't want to. It doesn't mean anything. Endeavor, to me, is the same thing as the word should. You really should have put your child in a diaper in the pool. So it's not enforceable. The word shall is your friend. Shall means you must. There's no endeavor, good try, good faith, I forgot. There's none of that. It is you did or you didn't. It's shall. Go with shall. All right. And then the fourth is my like most this is I hate the word reasonable. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. And it's the most common situation because folks feel like using the word reasonable makes them sound reasonable. It's like a natural thing. Well, I'm just trying to be a reasonable board member. We're not trying to be your police. We're really being reasonable, but you are shooting yourself in the foot with the word reasonable. Here's why. I already told you this morning how important and how amazing the business judgment rule is for you. It is the shield. If you use the word reasonable, a court will say, oh, no, they don't want the business judgment rule protection. They want us to look into whether the board was acting reasonably. So we're not going to apply business judgment rule here. We're going to apply the reasonableness standard. And we're going to look and see if every board member who is involved in this, what they were thinking. They're all going to have to testify. We're going to have to get into 2 years of discovery and check all of your email. Let's make sure that you are being reasonable, board member. First of all, so I hate it. And it's also, what does reasonable actually mean? It's different for everybody. It's different for every judge. You are biting off litigation. That is what you are asking for if you use the word reasonable. Please avoid it. Many of the old co-op rules and bylaws include the word reasonable because they predate the business judgment rule. Business judgment rule came around in the 90s. So if you have an older set of rules, they probably use the word reasonable because that was the standard at the time. Business judgment rule came into effect to protect boards and board members because people weren't volunteering for their boards. Every board was being sued. So in the 90s, right? If you have an older building, you might want to look and amend, take out the word reasonable everywhere you see it. I hate it. You will learn to hate it if you end up getting sued. So we have about 15 minutes left. The next slides that I have are really on like specific topics. The first one is smoking, which I know one of you already asked about. So I'm going to try to run through a few of these in our last remaining time. But before I get into these examples, the examples that I'm going to be talking about are smoking, noise, alterations, pets, and then a new one for a new and exciting law, e-bikes. But before I do that, I want to make sure, because these are really just specific examples, I want to make sure that I address any questions you all have regarding like the substance of what I've discussed this morning. And then we can run through the examples. So go ahead and put them in the chat or come off mute if you have. I see one already here. Do you need a lawyer to amend the proprietary lease if you have a majority needed to amend? Or can you just amend the controlling documents internally? If so, where should these documents live? Okay, obviously I recommend that you have a lawyer do it. These are highly technical legal documents that you don't want to make a mistake on. If you don't have general counsel, I don't think it's an expensive endeavor. You should probably find a lawyer to be your general counsel who's there for you. You know, we do this for so many buildings. There's buildings that I hear from once a year. And just for a one-off amendment or a one-off, hey, can you write a letter to this owner? I think that if you have one or can find one, it's just good. You don't have to pay to have one on retainer. You can just use them as you need them. And I think this is something that you need a lawyer for. Can you do it on your own? Absolutely. If you feel like you want to go ahead and write a new provision in and you want to make, and you feel confident that you can have everybody properly vote and approve, documents should live at your managing agents or your board's or secretary of your board, wherever they keep files. But if you're going to amend the proprietary lease, every single owner or shareholder needs to have it also. Everyone, otherwise it's not enforceable. They need to vote on it and receive it. Any other questions on the general sort of overview that I've gone through so far? If not, I'll move into smoking. Hearing none. All right. Well, smoking is a hot topic and it always is. And it's funny because I run the continuing education for lawyers for the New York City Bar. And we twice a year do a hot topics presentation. And every time I'm putting a panel together and I'm always asking for topics, it's like a hot topic every 6 months. Everyone wants to talk about smoking. So this is a really important one. In addition, you are required as a board to have a policy on smoking, even if that's to say we have no policy. You have to have one. Maybe it was 2017, 2018. The city actually came out with a law that said every building has to have a smoking policy. Doesn't mean you have to ban it, but you have to have a written policy, and that policy has to be incorporated into the governing documents and into all rental or sales agreements. That's called Local Law 147, pretty recent. One of the questions I received was, does this go into the bylaws or house rules? Well, if it's a non-controversial rule that merely echoes the law in the state, I would tell you this isn't really a big deal. Put it in the house rules. It's already a law. You're not needing to likely enforce it by using the house rules. You're merely adding it into the house rules to comply with local law 147. No big deal. You could put it in the house rules. I put on the bottom of this slide, because you all have the handout too, and if you need it, just a couple of the local city and state codes on smoking. So you could actually just mirror this if you don't already have one. New York City's Smoke-Free Air Act is that smoking is not prohibited in the common areas. And that's in building with 10 or more apartments. Under that, if you have a smaller, I think someone said they were in a 9-unit co-op on here, this won't apply to you. So you probably would have to pass a rule saying no smoking in the hallways. But there is also a general catch-all in the New York City Administrative Code that says, the emission of air contaminants that's a detriment to health is prohibited. So, again, this one isn't so specific, but it is a law that you can enforce as a board. And you can echo this in your house rules if you don't already have a provision. But bans are another matter. If you're going to actually change the way the owners or shareholders in your building are going to use their units, I strongly recommend you amend the bylaws. I'm going to harken back to Foreman just for a minute, because we're talking about something specific now. If your bylaws say no smoking will be allowed in the common areas, let's say your bylaws, your primary governing documents, the proprietary lease, whatever, says that, and you go and put a ban of smoking in your house rules, what do you think a court would say when you go to enforce the ban? Per Foreman, right? That you're stepping on the toes of the governing documents and it's an overreach. It will not be enforceable. So that one's clear, right? That's a Foreman lesson. We can't overstep. Smoking is contemplated. You're not allowed to smoke in the hallways. Now you're coming and saying no units too. You're stepping on the toes. So I would say here, generally speaking, if you're going to do a ban, even if the bylaws are silent, because it is such a hot topic, try to put it in the bylaws. If you can't get quorum, if you're one of those buildings that has foreign owners and you just can't get quorum and the bylaws are silent, you can put it in your house rules, okay? But I'm telling you now that enforcing this house rule as a ban against a smoker who lives in their apartment, it is going to be challenging. You can do it. If the bylaws are silent, you can do it as a house rule. Just know that it's going to be a fight. My most favorite defense I hear is, Smoking is my God-given right. Smoking is I'm an American. You're discriminating against me. I'm a smoker. That is who I am. That's who I identify as a person. This issue has been tried all the way up in court. It is not a violation of the US Constitution or federal law or New York state law to ban smoking in a building. There are protected classes, right, of citizens. You can't discriminate someone based on race, gender, familial status, all of that. Being a smoker is not one of those things. There's no such thing as discriminating against a smoker. So you can ban, you can curtail, you can specify when, how, where, in units, out of units, smoking, where you want smoking in your building. You can even say you don't want it to be within 15 feet of the front door. I mean, you can really go pretty far in what you can do. Again, foreman, if the bylaws are silent and the proprietary lease is silent, you can do it in a house rule, but know that a smoker feels like they're being evicted when you ban it in their units and they can't smoke in their units. They will fight. This is like a hot button. It's like someone's pet. It's like prohibiting someone's pet. It's like a family member. It's part of who they are. They're part of how they identify. Okay, I see a text here. Okay, I have 10 minutes remaining. A survey will be sent to you shortly. Please look at your email and complete the survey for CNYC. They would very much like your feedback. But we're not done yet, but I'm supposed to give you a warning to look for that survey. Please confirm that smoking includes marijuana. Do we need to specifically state marijuana in our rules? Great question. For the longest time, I used to be able to enforce a no marijuana smoking rule based on the general provisions of illegality. So most governing documents say you can't do something illegal. Well, guess what? Now marijuana is legal. So a lot of those old provisions about illegality will not govern smoking. So this question is a great illustration of my drafting rule number 1, which is be explicit in your rules. Like look down at the bottom of this slide where it says the New York City Administrative Code, Title 24. This one is like general but specific, right? It says no emission of air contaminants. I think you'd be good with that, right? Marijuana smoke is an air contaminant, just the same as tobacco smoke. If I'm writing one of these provisions, and if we had another hour, I would show you all the provisions that I would write for this. I would go really specific. I'd say no smoking, no vaping, no e-cigarettes. I mean, I go into a long list. And at the end of the long list, I say, or other emission of air contaminants that may cause detriment to health, safety, and the welfare and comfort of any person. So get as explicit as you can so that when someone says this was just the e-cigarette or it's just a marijuana vape, you say, and look at this rule. Like you specifically knew this. This was sent to your home and email 6 months ago, and it is posted on our building link. Oh, the survey is now in the chat. I see that. It's now in the chat. So if you can see that as well. All right, Greg, condo bylaws use of units states that units may not be leased for transient residency less than 6 months or any legal purposes. House rules, leasing rules say leasing shorter than 1 year is not permitted. So I see here, you got a discrepancy. So guess what governs the bylaws? The house rules improper. You go with the use of units in the bylaws. It's the 6-month rule. You can't further restrict it or change it in the house rules. That's a foreman violation. Okay. When you're going to do a ban, how am I on time? Okay. When you're going to do a ban, if that's something you're interested in, there's things to consider. Who will it apply to? Remember, you have to treat all owners equally. Remember, we learned that? You can't grandfather. Owners who live here now, as the date of this, can still smoke, but every new owner from here on out who's buying subject to this rule cannot smoke? No. 2 different classes of owners. I've been asked that question multiple times because people feel like it's not fair to have it apply to people who currently live there. You have to treat everybody equally. Old owners, new owners, they're all alike. Determine where it will be restricted. Go specific. Don't just say common areas, indoor or outdoor, individual terraces, the roof, in front of the building, in the units, you know, whatever the amenity spaces are. Determine when it will go into effect. I really like a sunrise clause. Sunrise clauses mean it gives people due warning. It's September 1st, we're passing this rule. It's going to go into effect January 1st. That gives people time to decide, maybe I need to sell my unit. And determine the enforcement mechanism. Is this something that we're going to be able to fine on? And also remember a lesson we learned from earlier today, which is if you're going to institute the ban, are you ready to die on that hill? Because if you have the obligation, the shall obligation to enforce your rules, and you have someone that's like, I'm a smoker, I'm living in my unit and I'm smoking, you're going to end up having to go to court to enforce it. So make sure you're ready to do that, and that is important. It's important for the building. I'm going to just quickly go through my last few slides. Noise, carpet coverage. Typical provision is 80% of the floors get covered in some kind of floor covering, like a carpet or a rug. Typically, bathrooms and kitchens are excluded. Hours for music or instruments, hours for repairs or alterations. These are typically 9 to 5 for alterations. Child's play is a big one. No child's play in the hallways, or, you know, that kind of thing. I love a good catch-all for my boards. Again, this isn't explicit, but at least it will help you if you're not presently contemplating something that might come up. No lessee shall make or permit any disturbing noises in the building, or do or permit anything to be done therein which will interfere with the rights, comfort, or convenience of the lessees. And I love a good party rules. I love a good party rules because number of people, how many parties. I have some buildings that will say 25 max guests. If it's more than that, you have to hire a security guard. I mean, you can go in any different direction on the party rules. Co-ops typically tend to be a lot more restrictive than condos. Alterations. Again, we discussed this. Pay very close attention to what's already included in your governing documents. You don't want to overstep and have a foreman violation. Hours of work, duration of work, alteration agreement. You should have an alteration agreement. It's one of the most important ancillary documents a building can have. Pets. We already talked about pets with our foreman example. Prior board approval, restrictions on the breed, weight, type. Some buildings like to do pet interviews to see how the pet interacts. Leash or muzzle requirements, waste disposal, pet deposit. Oftentimes buildings want to keep money in a deposit so that if there is a problem, like a carpet gets destroyed or a couch gets chewed on, there's money to cover it. I like, as a lawyer, indemnification for damage. But of course, as I touched on briefly before, you'll need an exception for service animals or emotional support animals. And then last but not least, my new favorite rule that I'm instituting in all my buildings are e-bike policies. Electronic bikes and vehicles. There has been a rash of explosions and fires in the city from electric lithium-ion batteries. So many buildings are banning them altogether or requiring that they be certified. You can limit the location. They can only be stored in a basement storage area that might be fire retardant. And then most of all, for a lawyer, I care about assumption and risk and indemnification. And with that, I have 30 seconds for questions on any of those last slides that I just raced through. Any questions? No? Well, thank you so much for, oh, wait, I see one. Do I have time to do one? What is the best reference for non-lawyers to understand the foreman rule? Can you email, provide a link? If you put your email in the chat, or you can chat it to me directly, I will send you the foreman decision. And with that, thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with me. I hope this was informative, and perhaps not too boring, 2 hours on the house rules, but I hope you learned something and thank you so much.